add the fact that in nature, the methanol in fruit is bound to something called pectin. Humans lack the enzyme to split the methanol off from pectin, so it goes through the body without doing any damage whatsoever. The body doesn't get exposed to the methanol because it's bound to pectin. So even though there's more of it, it's totally harmless in fruit. But with aspartame, you have the pure, unadulterated, free methanol and then formaldehyde. It's a small amount, but the body can't get rid of it. It's a cumulative phenomenon. So we have very, very toxic products.
Methyl alcohol is just deadly and probably provides most of the poisoning attributed to ethyl alcohol and alcoholics. It is the deadly one.
Aside from the pectin story, in fruit, in nature, you also are taking in equal amounts of ethanol. You get both methanol and ethanol, and so they counteract each other. And so there's essentially no impact. You're not poisoning yourself when you take in fruit. I believe you're poisoning yourself when you take in aspartame.
What's the difference between methyl and ethyl alcohol?
Okay, it's a difference of one carbon atom. Methyl alcohol has one carbon atom. Ethyl alcohol has two carbon atoms. The human metabolism is geared to using carbon atoms in groups of 2 or 3 or more. When you get down to 1, methyl alcohol, wood alcohol, has obligatory metabolism to formaldehyde. Formaldehyde, which is embalming fluid, is 5,000 times as potent a poison as is sipping alcohol.
The FDA, which is the watchdog of American safety that we have empowered to protect the American public against food additives and drugs, has repeatedly reviewed all of the data that has been forthcoming from hundreds of studies about aspartame.
Back in 1965, according to G.D. Searle, one of their researchers was working on an ulcer drug when he happened to get some of the substance on his finger, and instinctively he licked it, noticing its sweet taste. One of the first tests conducted on aspartame was a 52-week study of monkeys to determine the effects of aspartame on primates. 7 monkeys were fed aspartame with milk. 5 of those monkeys had grand mal seizures, and 1 died.
Monkeys have more of a reaction to ethanol, regular alcohol like vodka or scotch. They have a real high resistance to methanol, and even though they were fed aspartame with milk, they still came down with seizures, and 1 died of, I guess, cardiac arrest from overstimulated nervous system. Searle went back and got another physician, a fellow named Dr. Wellington, and this guy sat down and redesigned the monkey study.
In that same year, Dr. John Olney found that oral intake of aspartic acid could cause brain tumors in mice.
We had this situation where the company initially seemed to be responsive to the concerns, and they actually sent a team of researchers to Dr. Olney's laboratory, and they recreated the studies. The Searle investigators recreated the studies that showed this brain damage in animals, and they went back to Searle, and we waited to hear what Searle was going to do about this. And the next thing we knew, I would say that they probably went to Dr. Olney's lab mid-71. Mid-73, they applied to the FDA for a food additive petition to use NutraSweet as a sweetener. So I called the FDA and I said, this doesn't make any sense.
Dr. Olney was asked by G.D. Searle to conduct a study because there were some concerns. And it's interesting to note that these concerns came up before a lot of the major testing into the toxicity of aspartame became apparent. But my thinking as an FDA investigator is that G.D. Searle already knew that going into this.
Ultimately, FDA, using its good offices, interestingly enough, a major person there, created a meeting between me, Searle, and General Foods, which was going to be one of the main customers. And we met. And I said I didn't think that this would ever reach the market. And they said, well, they were sure it was going to be approved. And I thought that we were on 180 degrees opposite sides. It turned out that it was approved, but FDA asked them not to market it, and they held it up so that there could be hearings and so forth.
In 1974, the FDA approved the limited use of aspartame.
Do you know why they were sure it was going to be approved? You said that they said that it was sure that
Well, see, when I said I don't think it's going to reach the market, I was being very particular, but I didn't believe it was going to be approved because the evidence didn't show. They said it was. Now, one very strange fact in all of that is that I knew that they had the brain damage study from Olney's lab that their own people had done. And we talked about the various pieces of evidence that were problems. And I finally said, what about the brain damage problem from the animals in Dr. Olney's laboratory that your own people have gone and looked at? And he said, we don't think those are going to be a problem. Well, it turned out they weren't a problem because they didn't give them to the FDA. So here they had in their own files a study that raised very serious questions which they did not give to the FDA. That's a violation of law.
G.D. Searle did not inform the FDA of this study until after aspartame's approval. This approval came despite the fact that FDA scientists found serious deficiencies in all tests related to genetic damage.
And so all these concerns were all rolling around inside FDA, and they were trying to organize them into a policy. And every time they would organize them into a policy at the bench and science level, and they would go up one level to where the policy people were, the policy people would overrule them.
A month later, Olney and Turner filed a formal objection stating that they believed aspartame could cause brain damage.
But anyway, we filed our petition. Dr. Olney filed one and I filed one attacking the approval. And the FDA said, right, there are some factual information that we should look into. We'll have a public hearing.
Only because some of the investigators working for the Food and Drug Administration, looking at this data, knew that the data did not contain adequate safety information about aspartame.
In 1975, due to serious questions over the quality and validity of G.D. Searle's testing of aspartame and other pharmaceuticals, the FDA formed a special task force to examine 11 of the pivotal studies on aspartame. Pivotal studies are those upon which the FDA bases approval or disapproval. Of the 113 studies done on aspartame submitted to the FDA by Searle, 90 were conducted in the early to mid-1970s. Every test the FDA called pivotal was part of this 90. In March of 1976, the FDA completed their 500-page report after finishing their investigation.
The report by the FDA team that inspected it is the most devastating report about research that has probably ever been written about a specific company. And that led to a series of hearings in Congress and came up with a $12 million appropriation to FDA to enforce good laboratory practices. But what happened is there's a policy resolution, but NutraSweet and Searle got bypassed in the sense that they took this all over here and said, look at this terrible thing that's going on. There were a couple others that were going on at the same time. We've got to do something, and they did something. What they did was going forward, you have to meet these requirements. They didn't do anything about going backwards and saying, look, the stuff you came through here is killing people. Now, the reason they didn't do that at the time, because it happened in 75 and 76, is that it was the assumption of everyone in the process that the FDA was going to handle it. So FDA, one of the things FDA did that was so striking and remarkable is that they, knowing that they had this terrible situation on their hands, hired a group of pathologists. It's a pathology research group. FDA hired them to review the Searle studies, but had Searle pay for it. So the result was, here's a company which makes its money by being hired and paid for to do studies. Well, why would it do a study that was going to be critical of NutraSweet?
In 1977, the FDA Chief Counsel, Richard Merrill, recommended to U.S. Attorney Samuel Skinner that a grand jury be set up to investigate G.D. Searle.
Well, FDA did attempt to do something, and it wasn't the political part of the FDA. These were the people that really were trying to work and do well. One of the counsels lawyers for the Food and Drug Administration contacted the U.S. Attorney in Chicago and to bring an indictment against G.D. Searle for fraud, for deletion of records, manipulation of records, the falsification of records, and a number of other things on the testing that they did on aspartame and several other products as well.
Suddenly, U.S. Attorney Samuel Skinner began preliminary employment discussions with G.D. Searle's law firm, Sidley and Austin. The U.S. Justice Department urged Attorney Samuel Skinner to proceed with the grand jury, pointing out that the statute of limitations on prosecution would soon run out. Samuel Skinner withdrew from the G.D. Searle case, and Assistant U.S. Attorney William Conlin was assigned to the grand jury investigation. Shortly afterwards, Samuel Skinner left his job to work for G.D. Searle's law firm. The assistant he left behind let the statute of limitations run out on the aspartame charges. This assistant, William Conlin, was hired 15 months later by G.D. Searle's law firm, Sidley and Austin.
The common denominator for all of this, unfortunately, is money. And the amount of money that was flashed around induced people to drop the lawsuit against G.D. Searle and come work for the very firm that they were going to try for illegal activity. And that's what happened with the U.S. Attorney. That's what happened with several people working for the Food and Drug Administration at that time. If they passed aspartame, literally, they were promised great jobs when they finished with FDA.
And it was interesting, the main guy that made the decisions that overruled them in the Bureau of Foods went on to work for the Soft Drink Association. And actually 7 of the key people that made decisions that kept NutraSweet moving through the process ended up working for one or another NutraSweet using industry. That's kind of an interesting side effect to the whole thing.
I like to do well at things. It's important to me that if you're given an assignment that you try to do it the best you can. I'm afraid that some people confuse that with some sort of single-mindedness on my part.
Donald Rumsfeld went into the company after he left Washington, after Ford lost, and that would be in 1977. Is in business, and he was the congressman from there. And then he went to the White House, where he was White House Chief of Staff, and then he became the Secretary of Defense. And he's involved in a whole group of people around Chicago that are they're involved in a whole range of things, national security being one of them. He was also a part of the Rand Corporation, one of the major defense think tanks. He's a very bright guy, like in The Best and the Brightest, you know, the kind of people that brought us Vietnam. These are people who believe that thinking is the primary way that you get through life. Having values, feelings, and so forth, they denigrate. So he took over this company, and it was going down the tubes completely. It had FDA investigations. It had grand jury investigations. It was losing money. Its stock was down. A person was hired to come in and explain why the FDA was so down on them, and went through all of their records and said, "You guys haven't got a chance. This company is a mess, a total mess." And he went in with a full team of politicians. He went in with himself, a politician. He brought his special assistant, who was a Republican Party operative, worked with the Republican National Committee, brought in a press guy from there, brought in lawyers, and they took on the issue of this company as a political issue. And one of the first things that not first, but somewhere in that first year, it was late in the year, he called me and said, "Let's have a meeting." So I went and I met with him. We flew into the Madison Hotel and we met and we talked. And my point was that the struggle that was going on around NutraSweet was a scientific struggle. We needed to know the scientific answers. And this is before the Public Court of Inquiry had ruled. We needed to know the answers. So why don't we, the people who were raising all of the questions about NutraSweet and the company, together create a set of protocols that we would agree address the serious questions that needed to be looked at to decide whether or not it should be marketed. So we had this meeting. And for about 6 months, his staff and I and our group negotiated out how we could proceed on this. His own scientists didn't want to do it. For example, at the time that they put their evidence into FDA in 1973, There were no requirements at FDA to examine effects on the brain from food additives.